The study of Norse mythology is, quite simply, a game of picking up scraps and trying our darndest to make sense of them. The ancient Greeks, Egyptians, Babylonians, and friends wrote down stories on stories on stories because literature was their repository for culture, but your average Scandinavian at the height of the Viking Age wouldn't have any reason to write down their myths. They knew their religion, their community knew it, and anyone who wanted to learn a story could just ask their local storyteller. What's a hunk of parchment good for when you've got people? This makes perfect sense and is also academically infuriating. The most we can glean about Norse myth from the Viking Age itself comes from place names in reference to the gods and scattered runestones carved with blessings or short phrases of poetry. But around the year 1000, the Scandinavian kingdoms convert to Christianity and cool it with the paganism. Then 2 centuries after that, we get our 2 and only 2 major written collections of Norse mythology, the Poetic and Prose Eddas, appearing not in mainland Scandinavia, but all the way over in Iceland. Now, compared with the rest of the Viking world, Iceland was by far the best positioned to create a textual record of the culture, but that doesn't guarantee it would be written by someone who wasn't an absolute madman. And that brings us to one Snorri Sturluson, poet, politician, biggest wildcard in Icelandic history, and, unfortunately, our best hope. So, to learn how Iceland's #1 menace lent us half the corpus of Norse mythology, let's do some history. The mythology we call Norse arose from a shared Germanic culture reaching from Britain through Northern Europe and into Scandinavia, speaking similar Germanic-based languages and worshipping similar deities. But by the time the Vikings got going in the 800s AD, they were the only ones still on the pagan party boat. And of that bunch, Iceland was always the odd one out. It was permanently settled in the late 800s by, among other various travelers, Norwegian aristocrats who hated the idea of Norway having a king now and got the absolute hell out of there. So in their new home, they created a pointedly anti-royal commonwealth governed by their parliament, the Althing. And this uniquely collective arrangement made them the only ones to vote to convert to Christianity in 1000 AD. The mainland kingdoms imposed it top-down and fiercely, but Iceland essentially struck a compromise. Christianity was the public religion, but whomst anyone might have worshipped at home was nobody's business. That earned them the benefits of trade with the rest of the Christian world, while Icelanders regarded stories about the gods as harmless rather than heresy. And the Icelanders loved to tell stories. It kept them entertained through the cold winters and long nights, and was their main connection to a shared Scandinavian ancestry reaching back to their homelands. The skill set for storytelling also mirrored the skills required for Iceland's main public servants, the leading law speaker or lögmaður and the many regional goðar. These officials essentially memorized Iceland's laws and could recite them from memory to settle disputes. Not terribly far off from the talents of a poet, and likely a large part of why Icelandic stories have so many dang courtroom dramas. All of Iceland's unique circumstances add up to a culture which prized memorization and recitation, expressed their heritage through stories of their ancestors, had a lot of spare time in the evenings, and was comparatively much more chill with reminiscing about paganism. Even before Christianization, Icelanders were regarded as the best poets in Scandinavia, having invented the saga as a genre of performance. But especially after Christianization, they remained the repository of ancestral and mythological knowledge via their poetry. Strictly speaking, the sagas are mostly prose, not poetry, but it's the same core idea, so yeah. Then, around the 1100s, they got their hands on the Latin alphabet and started writing stuff down. First was bits of poetry, then a codification of the laws in 1115, and by the 1200s, the sagas and full myths. The earliest collection is an anonymous, untitled work from the turn of the 13th century-ish, compiling mythological poems from different places and times, known to us today as the Poetic Edda. Half of the work recounts stories of deities, and half focuses on human heroes. It isn't comprehensive, but it's a pretty dang good account of how Icelanders in general understood the myths they received from their ancestors through storytelling. Then, there's the other book on Norse myths, and that brings us to possibly the single most consequential figure in Icelandic history for 2 very different reasons. Sometime after the anonymous Poetic Edda, the poet Snorri Sturluson composed Iceland's second major work of Norse myth literature, the Prose Edda. Originally titled as just Edda and retitled for convenience by later historians, Snorri's work is part catalogue of myths, part instruction manual for poetry, and part praise poem for the King of Norway. This is the primary reason for Snorri's lasting fame, but at the time it was a distant second to his career in politics. Mr. Sturluson is, quite simply, the biggest menace in Icelandic history and singularly responsible for the most ruinously bloody period of civil war the island ever had. Permit me a detour into Icelandic politics to demonstrate how utterly Loki-brained this man was. Snorri was a member of a powerful clan known as the Sturlungar, or Sturlungs. He was educated in language, law, and culture in the 1180s and 90s, and was elected as Iceland's law speaker in 1215. He served his term and left in 1218 to go buddy up with the teenage Hakon IV, who just became king of Norway. The Norwegian kings had their eyes on Iceland for centuries, and Hakon was itching to go to war and bring Iceland into his realm, but Snorri convinced the king that he could sway the Althing to vote for a union rather than resorting to violence. This was a noble idea, and very stupid. Snorri came back to Iceland and served as law speaker from 1222 to 1232, during which time he hoped to consolidate power over the Gothard and present Iceland to Hakon on a silver platter, whereupon Hakon would say thank you, call him handsome, and make him regent of Iceland on behalf of the king. Instead, half the island and most of his own family hated this plan and violently opposed it, including nephews and some of his own sons. Granted, Snorri's personal life is a saga of so much philandering, divorces, and illegitimate children that we wouldn't be stretching to change a letter and call him Snorri Sturluson, but the political outcome of lots of sons was lots of rivals. That all spilled out to over 40 years of factional violence in Iceland, known as the Age of the Sturlungs, which is one very small step short of calling it the War of Snorri's Screw-Ups. Of course, Iceland didn't have the population to sustain huge armies campaigning for months on end, but a battle with a couple thousand soldiers is pretty grande by the standards of an otherwise quiet island. Snorri proved thoroughly incapable of keeping a lid on the conflict and went to Norway again in 1237 to make more bad decisions, allying with Hakon's duplicitous regent Skuli against the king, only for Skuli to get killed in 1240 and Hakon to hold enough of a grudge to send assassins after his bestie turned traitor Snorri. Thus are the consequences of the Grima Wormtongue grind set. Poor Mr. Sturluson was killed at his home by agents of the king in 1241, in an outcome that can only be described as entirely his fault and completely avoidable. The conflict continued in the decades after and culminated in the Althing voting to submit to Norway in 1262. What a mess. With this cursed knowledge, we also can't be surprised that the main chronicle of the conflict, the Sturlunga Saga, depicts Snorri as a scheming little weasel whose career had way too many consequences. Not quite fair, but not that off base. Considering that this national disaster of a man is also the island's single most famous poet, let's turn now to Snorri's literary career, bearing in mind that this man is essentially the equivalent of if William Shakespeare personally started the War of the Roses. It's more than fair to ask why this guy of all Icelanders left us the prose Edda, but his literary motivations weren't far off from his political ones. The mythological subject matter connects Iceland and Norway in a shared cultural heritage, and the instructional portions about how to understand and compose poetry address young poets in particular, as they'll be the ones in the royal courts of Norway entertaining their patrons. Icelandic poets were already in high demand on the mainland, and Snorri likely anticipated a political union would only grow that market. The myths then served as illustrative examples for poets to study, but even if pure cultural preservation wasn't the priority, Snorri was certainly conscious of what he was doing. The precise original format of the prose Edda is contested, as are its possible inspirations from Latin grammar treatises, but later editions show Icelanders being more interested in the Edda's instruction manuals for poetry than its myths, and that makes sense for the time period. The myths were certainly engaging, but they were old, distant, and slowly falling out of fashion. It was only in the 1600s, after the rediscovery of the Poetic Edda and the first Latin translation of the Prose Edda, that popular interest in Norse myths got going. And it's looking at his mythological content that we notice some really weird stuff from Snorri, stuff that calls into question whether we can trust the guy. Notably, a very Christian-sounding ending to the Ragnarok story, plus claiming there's a realm of an even higher heavenliness above Asgard and Valhalla, and that the Aesir are actually heroes from the Trojan War? Huh? It's weird, and it's really jarring to run into this stuff when you're just here to see Loki get up to shenanigans, but it's not as wonky as it first seems. Essentially, these are the consequences of telling the stories in a post-Christian context, but the actual effect on the narratives is pretty light. The Trojan Aesir, for instance, is a framing device confined mostly to the prologue, done largely as a hand wave to dispel any accusations of residual paganism. If the Aesir are Trojans, they aren't gods, and therefore aren't a threat to the church or the faith. This idea is also not original to Snorri, as a historical text from a century earlier pulls the same Trojan Aesir business, and the sus-looking ending to Ragnarok can't possibly be Snorri's bright idea because the original poem comes from the 900s. So in context and with an attentive eye, these spurious Christianizing editions are pretty easy to just pretend we didn't see and carry on enjoying the stories, or in the case of Ragnarok, actually seem legit. Our best evidence is that the overall tone and content of the Poetic and Prose Eddas are very similar. The anonymous Poetic Edda just skipped the heresy begone framing device. So the question we're left with as we get ready to crack into our copies of the Prose Edda is, can we really trust this weaselly, duplicitous boy to tell us anything accurate about Norse mythology? Essentially, we kinda have to, but honestly, we actually can. Snorri's intent was to present a shared heritage between Iceland and Norway and teach young poets through superlative examples from a vast bank of poetry Iceland was uniquely positioned to cultivate. Aside from some additions we can discard as obvious nonsense, his work is broadly consistent with the Poetic Edda, which, as far as we can tell, is the authentic received poetry from generations of Icelandic storytellers. So any invisible Christian bias in the stories isn't unique to Snorri. This man was an absolute human tornado who subjected Icelanders to generations of conflict in his quest to kiss up to Norway, but Iceland's agony is our swagony because the man wrote a mean book of myths. Thank you for watching. This video is a layup to a myth Red'll be telling next week, and if you're one of our fabulous patrons like these cool cats on screen, you already know which myth it is. Ooh, exciting. If you want to support the channel and let me gossip more about history's best weirdos, head over to patreon.com/OSP.